Okay, so if you have a Concourse 14 or a ZX14, perhaps other model bikes as well, you may have that maybe dreaded, I don't know if you want to call it that, startup cam chain rattle. And you heard that just now in the video where you crank it over and it sounds like marbles running around and it goes away pretty quick. I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now that don't panic, it is completely normal in this particular design. I'm going to go ahead and explain why in this video and show you another cam chain tensioner from an older inline four. This happens to be a Kawasaki as well. We'll go over the differences, and again I'll tell you why this one does that, so stand by. Alright, so the short answer as to why you hear that startup rattle is because of this. This is the cam chain tensioner off of a Concourse 14. And it's probably very typical to cam chain tensioners off of modern motorcycles like this. I'm going to show you one from a vintage or classic, kind of a mechanical one here in a little bit, just as a comparison, a little extra credit. But at this point, I just want to go over this. Now, this cam chain tensioner is kind of like a hydraulic lifter, where it's two-stage. You have a spring, so you have some spring pressure in here, and it's hydraulic, and that's the oil pressure that comes in from the actual, oil pressure system in the motorcycle from the oil pump, and it actually puts pressure in here and pushes this, that way, that away. All right, so, and I want to explain essentially why this thing makes noise when it first starts up after it's been sitting for a while, especially because, just like a hydraulic lifter, it's going to lose a little bit of that, back pressure in it. It's kind of bleed off basically. And then that's why you get that little rattle. And what that rattle really is, I'm going to illustrate this with a couple old screwdrivers here because I don't have any cam, tensioner parts laying around. But, inside there you have two cam chain guides. The one in the front of the motor would be fixed, and the one on this side of the tensioner would be movable, so it's essentially pivoting from the bottom like this. All right. So what you have here is, I'm going to lay it down to show you. You have this tensioner like this up against the cam chain guide. This one again is fixed, and you have the cam chain running around up to the cams and down to the crank, of course. And so there's a certain amount of spring tension pushing up against this one. And so that's your kind of a first stage. And then once the engine starts and it finalizes the actual pressure that puts up against that this actual guide, which ergo pushes against the chain and tightens it up. So this is all part of the design. So this is why it's making that noise. But I'm gonna take you over to the vise because it's kind of hard to do it just by freehand here. I'm going to show you why this, the movement that it allows until it pressurizes. I'll also show you on this Concourse 14 how you actually set this up to either, to install it. To take it out, you just unbolt it and pull it out. But you can't put these tensioners back in without setting them up first, and you always got to follow your service data. But the, this one in particular, and even the old one I'm going to show you is the same way. But stand by here in a second, and I'll move you over to the vise where I can hold this, and then I'll show you what I mean. Just like other cam chain tensioners, it will have some sort of ratcheting mechanism that allows it to come out but not go back in. But in this case, this one has some distance that it can move before it actually has a positive stop. All right, so to really illustrate this, I'm going to go ahead and set it up where it would be first installed. That'll kill two birds with one stone here, because I'm going to show you how you load this up if you're going to reinstall it. And this is probably typical of similar ones out there, but this is the Concourse 14 ZX14 one. Now there's two features here you have to manipulate. This guy right here is a little wire that you can see. You have to squeeze it together, and that'll allow it to actually retract in. And this little wire up here, you can see this one right there, is the one that actually locks it in place and cocks it essentially, so you can actually install it and properly install it. Because one thing you don't want to do is try to install one of these when it's well, that was embarrassing. One thing you don't want to do is try to install one of these with it extended. because it's only going to go back so far. And so if you get it in, and let's say it's about that far away from the surface of the cylinder head, and you pull it in with the bolts, you're going to have a world of hurt in there because it's essentially going to push things apart and break stuff. This has to be cocked. It has to be set up in or armed, if you will. So in this case, this is how we do it. What you do on this, I'm going to try to get my fat hands out of the way here and show you, is you got to squeeze these two guys together, and then this allows it to go down. I'm going to switch hands here. See if I can do this a little bit clearer. You squeeze this together, and I usually use a pair of tweezers. I guess if you have little nails or something, you can get it. But this, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, unfortunately. All right. Now, once you get it down that far, you can see it's really hard. And then up here, this top clip needs to be pulled in, squeezed together into that groove that's machined in there. It's a very precise groove, sharp edge. And then what you do is get that clip right there to go into that groove, and then just slowly release. And then it hangs up on that groove essentially, and now you're in a position where you can reinstall it. All right, that's how you got to do this one. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate when it's first installed and the motor gets turned around, and to show you what it does. And at that point I can explain a little bit better as to why you have that little rattle when you first start. Okay, so we got this installed. Follow your service manual, but the service manual in the Concours says once you install this, service manual is going to tell you to rotate the motor around slowly, and that way once the cam chain tightens and it pushes the guide up against this, it's going to give it enough force where that's going to spring back out of the way, and then this allows to come forward. You see how it ratchets. So it'll get to a certain point, and then it stops because it's pushing up against the cam chain guide, which is up against the cam chain. Now, this can only go back a certain amount and lock. So if it's living right here, then what happens is when there's no oil pressure, like this has been sitting for a while, this can actually move back and forth like that, because it can go back to that point and that's it. But this is not where the chain is tight. There's just a certain amount of distance there that it has to be able to travel back on before it has a positive stop. Now really, you'd have to ask yourself, well, if it ratchets way up here and it goes all the way back there before it hooks that ratchet part again, and what's the purpose of it? And the purpose of it is to make sure that the cam chain's not going to come off or knock, jump a couple of teeth or something. It has a certain amount of positive stop here. So, normally this thing's going to be living in a position about like this, all right? And it's going to be sitting in there with that spring tension up against the cam chain guide. And again, when there's no pressure in there, it's allowed to do this. So when it first starts up, you're going to get a little of this, and then the pressure comes out and it pushes against that cam chain guide, and now it's nice and firm, and then you don't hear the rattle anymore. It's usually only for a second or two anyway, until it develops some pressure. But so that, this is why you get that in these hydraulic cam chain tensioners, at least this particular kind, because again, there's a certain amount of distance here it has to go, and even if it clicks again into another notch, there's still that same distance there. Okay, so you're going to have that little hydraulic dampening, I guess you want to call it, area that it lives in, and I would suspect that the reason why they use these in this particular bike is because it's got variable valve timing. That's just a theory of mine. I'm not 100% sure of that. But because of the variable valve timing, I think they want to have something that gives a little buffer, in there instead of a hard stop. And that's what we're going to cover next. I'm going to show you an older one that from like a older Kawasaki inline 4 that is a hard stop. It goes out and it will not come back in even a smidge. All right, so let me show you that as a comparison. All right, so we already covered that one. We'll set that to the side. This is the one from the Concours. This is a typical KZ1000, inline 4, older Kawasaki type of cam chain tensioner. There's two types you're going to find like this. There's this type that's a wedge type, and I'm going to show you the wedges here in a second. And then there's another type that's an actual ratcheting type. And they both do the exact same thing. The only difference between the two is there's going to be like a ratchet across the top of this plunger with a little catch. I don't have one to show you, unfortunately, but what it does is it'll ratchet out, click, 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 click. It's a very fine, orientation, if you will, as opposed to this, which you can see how far apart those are. This is very fine. It's essentially a rack that's like a rack and almost a rack and pinion type thing, but it's a rack and a ratchet, where the actual delineations of the little parts of the rack are very, very fine. And so when this thing click, 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 it'll absolutely lock in that position, and that's it. Just like this one does, except this one does it differently. Now in these KZ1000, this is from an 1100, but it's the same damn thing. What they have is essentially two wedges. Let's see if we can get one out here. Come on, you. There it is. And this is what one wedge looks like. Right there. And then there's a mating wedge inside there. Now this pin here orientates essentially with a slot that's milled or machined into this plunger. You can't really see it right now, and that just keeps it oriented. That keeps it from turning this way, so that way it's always clocked properly. But essentially what you have then is you have another one of these inside there. So if you can picture it, it's like this. All right, so you have this one this way and then this one that way. And so these two things articulate with each other, and you can kind of feel it when you put it in. It'll go in only one way. In other words, if I tried to put it in against that, it just won't go. But then when it finds its spot, it's going to drop down inside there. Now the way this one works is when you first install one of these guys, it's very simple. It isn't as complicated as loading this one up and getting ready to put in. On this one, all you have to do is take this off, take that out, and then you can see that you just have spring tension here. That's different from the ratcheting one. The ratcheting one is more like this, where you have to actually cock it back and then you hit the ratchet thingy. There's a little thing in there and then it'll hold it in place. And then once again, when the cam chain hits it, it'll release that and then come out and put the appropriate amount of pressure on. And so this one, of course, doesn't do that. It's kind of a very, it's clever design actually. So when you put one of these in, you just make sure this is out and you bolt that into the head. This is going to hit well before this thing seats up to the cylinder head. And then so it's going to push back a certain amount, and that's fine. It's not going to cause a problem because that's what it's designed to do. And then once you bolt it in place, then you put the wedge back in, and then you slowly turn the motor over, and it's going to find where it wants to live. Now once this thing comes out a certain amount, like there for example, and the wedge is in place, it simply will not go back in. So that's another thing you have to keep in mind on these older ones. When you have that situation, you can see how it wants to push that out because it's a wedge. Well, when you put this back in, that has a spring putting pressure on that, it ain't going to go nowhere. And so what happens is this thing is just locked in place now, and that's how these are firmly, when they come out, they do not go back in at all, as opposed to this, which is why you have that kind of, I explained already, that rattle, because it's hydraulic. Once the oil pressure builds up, it's going to be as firm as this, but this one particular is a mechanical, and it just stops, and that's it. And of course, when you go to put these back in, as I said before, you never put them in extended. You'll get it about a certain amount away from the cylinder head, and you pull it in with bolts, saying, well, okay, well, I just have to pull it in. You're going to be not able to compress this to where it wants to live. It'll push up against the cam chain guide, damage everything, and you're done. The same thing with the ratchet ones. There's also another type that's more like this that you'll see on some bikes that'll have a I don't know if it has one of these or not in it, but what it'll have is a locking nut, a locking bolt really, and you put it back manually and you tighten that bolt up. Now there's only a certain amount of part of the shaft that comes back to where that bolt is, and so you pull it back, you tighten the bolt down, it locks it in this position. You put the cam chain tensioner in place, tighten up the mounting bolts, and then just release that. It's usually a 10 millimeter head bolt, and then it'll spring forward and it'll go to where it needs to go. And then you can tighten that back up, because now that thing has cleared that area where the only part of it is just like just the tip, and just for a second, you know, just just a little bit of the tip of it, or the back side of it. So anyway, that's why this one does that. I explained that already, because you have a certain amount of that area that it can, you know, it can release backwards into, just like a hydraulic lifter on a car, like especially an older car, something that's been sitting for a long time, and the valve train sounds like it's ready to detonate before it starts building up pressure, as opposed to one of these mechanical guys and the ratcheting type that's similar. So I hope that explains that, and it's just a comparo between an older one and this one here, to you know, get you a little bit more familiarized with why you may get that kind of rattle on your first startup of like a concourse or other type of motorcycle that uses these type of cam chain tensioners. All right, so that's it in a nutshell. Why this thing and other bikes like this do a little bit of a rattle dance, like a rattlesnake when they first crank over, because of a hydraulic boosted, hydraulic supported, hydraulic backed up, whatever you want to call it, cam chain tensioner. I don't know what Kawasaki says, but I can't remember. I've looked it up in the service manual only about a dozen times, but I can't remember. So again, nothing to worry about. Don't panic. And covered a little bit on different type of the old school cam chain tensioners, just as extra credit for you. So if you like the video, please consider subscribing. It definitely helps the channel. Definitely ring the bell, definitely, because that also helps that particular video as far as the stats go. And of course, ring the bell for the channel. You get notified when I put up other cool stuff like this. So until next time, let me close out by saying, don't just repair, restore. Catch you on the next one.